Alrighty then, you're listening to the Dodcast episode number 4, and my guest today is the Ungoogleable Michaelangelo. In his own words, a multi-dimensional artist with a psychoactive personality. Michelangelo's work finds expression through visual art, written and spoken word, music, film, and performance, and he's the host and creator of the podcast Self-Portraits as Other People. We're talking about psychedelics today.
We gotta do the cinematography on this thing and everything. All right, I think this should do the trick.
Cool. Okay, yeah. Well, thanks for joining me here.
You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
And so, yeah, lots of interesting connections I've picked up on in both you and I's sort of interests, obviously, but also in terms of personal connections that we have. Obviously, I discovered you through Jason. In fact, the first liminalist that I did with Jason, he mentioned having spoken to you like the night before, I think. So interesting that we also, both of us have had our conversations with Jason at quite similar times. It seems that there's, and also there's the other overlaps with Eric Davis and Anthony Peake as well. You mentioned, which is interesting. Right. Yeah. So, yeah, all great stuff. I guess it would be interesting first to know how you got in contact with Jason, because you mentioned that was it via Dave Oshana?
Well, Jason reached out to me via Dave Oshana. I guess Dave Oshana had somehow stumbled upon my platforms, on my podcast, Self-Portraits as Other People, and my website, and had referred it to Jason. And then Jason reached out to me. And like I said in my little intro to my podcast, at first I was kind of reluctant. I was curious, and I checked out his work. And then as I glanced around, I was like, put it on the back burner, because obviously Jason is very prolific and has a vast array of material, and some of it stood out as kind of like some of it was like in my zone and some of it was out of my zone, and I felt like this is something for a later time. And then kind of like the synchronistic undertow and the connect the dots fabric of it all kind of like wove it in, which also included the Eric Davis, Anthony Peake connections, because as I basically got vortexed into Jason's world and started really like feeding on the intrigues there, I started seeing the connection between Eric's thinking, or Eric's approach to thinking, and Jason's, and I felt there was a connection there. So I did a quick Google search of both their names, and then I found those conversations they'd had and delved into those. And then I don't know why Anthony Peake came up, but for some reason I was like, I have a feeling that there's like Peake somehow like plays into this network as well, because it's also in some way, I feel like Eric to a lesser degree, but all of us were kind of like linked into this Julian Jaynes, Philip K. Dick network, which are, I think, very important nodes in this network of a particular kind of exploration. And so indeed, also the Anthony Peake search, although what it brought up was an old post that Anthony had put up saying that he was going to have a conversation with both Eric actually and Jason, and neither of those come to fruition. So.
Yeah, Anthony Peake is well, my own connections with Anthony Peake and Jason have involved huge amounts of synchronistic overlapping, like sort of stacking connections. You know, and it seems like certain individuals seem to be nodes, as you say, of kind of this this overlap. It's almost like there are certain, you know, hesitate to use sort of these slightly hackneyed words like vibrational levels, but it certainly does feel like that, you know, that there are certain ranges of frequencies that people kind of operate at, and those people tend to find each other. They're sort of oscillating at some kind of similar frequency. But the interesting thing is, you know, you have you have people who seem to operate within these zones, but also there's a great deal of diversity between them. Taking say Anthony and Jason as two examples, that when I found out those two were connected themselves, it was sort of, oh right, okay, yeah, well, there's all these kind of things kind of clicking together and connecting up.
I think it's a I mean, as we take the path less traveled, there's we're always going to magnetize some kind of stepping stones, right? So that we don't just sink into the marshes of unexplored territory. And for instance, like I mentioned, like Julian Jaynes and Philip K. Dick, those are like particular steps that, I think Philip K. Dick is something that's more like mainstream too, because of like the movie adaptations of his books and things like that. And then Julian Jaynes has more like fallen more off the grid. But I feel like people like a Jason or an Anthony Peake they're rigorous researchers, each in their own way. And so they're kind of like gatekeepers to these kinds of things. So if you start walking this path, or if you yourself are also a gatekeeper, it's going to, like magnetize these similarities that are, as you're saying, also quite divergent. Because if you look at Anthony, he comes from a much less, I think, experiential side of and much more like scientific, pragmatic side of things. Like what you were saying, kind of like a spiritual materialism. Like he wants to ground it all in the data. Whereas I think Jason is coming more from the experiential and also has like a very pragmatic side. And then I think much more of I come from side of fiction and artistry and things like that. And though I try to be as pragmatic and grounded as possible and critical as possible within it, I take my liberties to weave through and slither through, because ultimately I want to be able to tether it all in experience. And I feel like one of the reasons that probably both of us connected with Jason at the same time or similar time over similar topics is that this is something that he is working through and trying to kind of reconcile within himself, because I feel like there is a big amount of unresolved chaos surrounding his feelings regarding, say, his Icarus phase, or the psychedelic experience. There's a part of him that has disowned it, but he also, in our conversation, I see that he's also recognized that has become a kind of projection, perhaps, where like I had sent him some of my writings because he had asked for some pieces to prepare, and I'd sent him kind of like a smorgasbord of things, and he had initially felt averse to that as well, simply because of the psychedelic aura around them, which I felt kept him from looking deeper into it. Because what I realized from listening to this last Liminalist conversation between the two of you, it kind of like painted off this dichotomy within that field, where he was talking about, because he actually brought me up again in that conversation and purposefully mispronounced my name as Michelangelo as kind of like his little jab in there. But then ironically, he mispronounced his own name at the end, which I found very amusing. He called himself Dodson, called me Michelangelo. But he brought it up in the context of kind of what did he say? Like a crystal matrix. He described it as like psychedelics, like the UFOs, kind of like a crystal matrix that then like radiates outward into this kind of like field, right? So the way I interpret that is you have the psychedelic experience, which is kind of the boundary dissolving. It's like the shamanic shampoo. It is literally the washing of the brain, the deconditioner of the mind, through which you fall into a pre-cultural zone. And then coming out of that, you recreate culture, you recreate a narrative around this unspeakable terrain. But then I think the trappings that he's talking about and the what is generated from that crystal matrix outward is the various cultural narratives, which become potentially a control system, right? An interface through which the mind can be controlled. So imagine somebody was more naive or not as creative to come up with their own interpretations, they come out of this space with a kind of illuminated confusion, which can then be paved over with these particular narratives that are already ready to kind of, just like when you're born into the world, you're wrapped in a name, right? So you can be controlled and summoned. So similarly, I think the cultural game is a game of names and a game of definitions that are kind of like ready when you come out of that zone. So I feel like he's become very weary of that because he has been very susceptible. Like I've been reading Dark Oasis, which is his accounts with John de Ruiter, the Dutch-Canadian guru charlatan type. So I'm beginning to understand more and more too of his guardedness, and because he's a very sensitive thinker, I think Jason is, and it makes him susceptible. And so his work has always been kind of like the soul retrieval, the kind of like scrubbing off, exfoliating of influences in order to like regain himself. So I see those resistances in our interactions as well, even though there's a part of him that wants to embrace, I think, the revelations that he has had and the kind of breakthroughs that he's had with it. There's also a part of him that's very on guard about it.
Yeah, obviously the one of the big thrusts of the debate we had, or discussion at least we had the other day, was our mutual relationships to psychedelics, and the role that these could play in human experience from now on. And it was very interesting and provocative for me discussion, particularly towards the end. It was kind of saying he felt this push to sort of say, come on Luke, come on Eric, come on Anthony, let's be serious about the threat that these things pose. And it's like, because I'm so I connect so well with Jason's work, and we have an ancestral connection in many. We have sort of various kinds of interesting family and personal connections, and his way of thinking and writing has been enormously influential on me over the past 5 years since I discovered his work. And so where someone else may have the same level of reservation towards psychedelics, I wouldn't probably have given them nearly the time today, so I would have just been like, because I've never had any interaction with Jan Irvin, if you've come across his work at all, but
just through Jason's mentioning here and there, which is I think what plays into his kind of Terence McKenna disdain, I think, is largely influenced by Jan Irving. And from what I've dipped into that, like I just did a quick search of a couple of things, and I wasn't really convinced by it because it's an interpretation of some of Terence's words, and I just don't think that he's saying what they're saying he's saying. In that sense.
There's a few there's a particular quote that was taken out of context by Jan about being recruited, and
exactly, yeah, which to me is more like a poetic liberty about the personification of the mushroom, in that sense. And then there are a couple of other sentences in there that then he kind of like picks apart and turns over, but I just don't find it a convincing argument. And I feel like if you take that one thing, you have to also look at the larger body of what Terence professes. And there's a lot of, hours and hours and hours of rants and raves that they counteract that idea of being an operative, it seems to me, because ultimately it's like, I don't think it's the psychedelics that are the danger. I think the danger is the culture that's built around it. And which is also Terence's message, right? Culture is not your friend. If you start becoming occupied with all these celebrities, then you're missing the point and you're giving it all away. It's like, it comes back to like everything you believe, everything all the the social constructs that you've built up in your mind, you test the integrity of those when you step into the psychedelic experience. When you gaze into the void, you'll see like how much of it holds up. So ultimately, any kind of control structure that's put into place outside of it stands the chance to be, again, overturned by the psychedelic experience itself. So it's saying, so the conversation about this crystal matrix being generated from that and the perils of that, I think you could easily replace the idea of that being talking about psychedelics as talking about writing. Mm-hmm. Writing is a very valuable tool that can be used for all kinds of purposes, can be appropriate for all kinds of purposes, whether that's self-exploration, whether that's soul retrieval, whether it's exposition, whether it's creative, whatever it may be. And it can also be used for propaganda. It can also be used for all kinds of other things. So, but like at the same time, it's like, I don't see Jason attacking writing as a dangerous thing, you know, that he still uses a lot. So it's all, I think and I understand the weariness, and I think that his critical voice in the matter is very valuable, and it's also one of the reasons I gravitate towards it, because it is a voice that you don't hear it that much in the kind of psychedelic culture. Yeah. You don't hear a lot of caveats. There's a lot of kind of like back patting, head nodding, and kind of like glorifying language where everything is medicine. But it's, you know, like that's also an application. Like, are you taking it because you're sick? Mm-hmm. Are you taking it because you're working on healing something? Is it a subtle something? Are you working on physical ailments? Or are you just doing this to gain power or for fun? Or, you know, like there's so many different applications to it. So I appreciate the kind of more critical caveat that's thrown into the ring. And I think it is a very valuable voice to have within those circles. But I do think that there's a distinction to be made between the psychedelic itself, and because the idea that somebody like a McKenna is a CIA operative or whatever, right? Like, what is it? Is it the agenda then to push psychedelics onto the people to soften their minds, to make them more malleable and controllable? Because at the same time, it does quite the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one could say that the continuing interest of, you know, elite, powerful actors in the intelligence community in psychedelics could be a way to try and kind of, one way of looking at it could be that you've got to keep a lid on this, you know, all these altered consciousnesses that are happening. It's like, okay, well, psychedelics are in the culture now. Maybe that was the result of deliberate intelligence programming. Maybe it was spontaneous, maybe a bit of both. You know, that's but now that's neither here nor there, because they're here and people are taking them. And there's lots of hype in the tech world about microdosing. There's lots of, you know, maps and things like this. And it's like, yeah, well, we're gonna keep these things in the confines of you know, our established structures of institutions and things.
Well, yeah, it's like there was that meme about that. You know, in the '60s, you take psychedelics to like free your mind and stick it to the man, and now you take microdoses so you can be more productive at work.
And you know, you could see that as being a long-term plan or not. I mean, this is where I'm very much in a, you know, as Jason would put it, a liminal place in terms of all this. I've looked at the you know, the critical stuff, and I've looked at some of Jan Irvin's stuff, and it's like there's some stuff some stuff that Jan Irvin's uncovered. I don't know if he's exactly the first to uncover it, but certainly it was brought to my attention by reading his stuff. For example, like Gordon Wasson's mushroom expedition being directly funded by MK Ultra.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting little fact that I was made aware of by Jan Irvin. But he himself, Jan Irvin, is, I've never had any contact with the guy. Don't really feel like I would, because I think he's a bit. I don't know if he's a very stable person, actually. I have to say, without. negatively of anyone, especially someone I don't know, but certainly
Right.
from my own, some friends of mine who set up Breaking Convention, if you've heard of that.
Yeah, yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Yeah. So that when they started, they did the first one in University of Kent here in Canterbury, in the southeast of England, 2011, and they invited Jan to speak at the conference because it's like, well, important that we have lots of different angles and critical voices are really welcome here. And Jan Irvin flipped out and said, "You're just trying to get me here because you're all CIA and you're just trying to bring all the hippies together so you can brainwash."
Right. He has a very adversarial stance rather than wanting to integrate or infiltrate even
Yeah.
that the kind of scene. Yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't do him any favors because it's like, okay, I mean, all right, there's some interesting stuff here with MK Ultra, with CIA, Gordon Wasson, and the use of psychedelics by the American military and the intelligence services and all kinds of things like that. But again, it comes down to this thing of does this mean we have to potentially throw the baby out with the bathwater? Because there is something kind of there's a benign aspect to the psychedelic experience. I think, as I think you would agree that there's something positive and beneficial that can be gained from it, as well as.
I think the nebulous and liminal aspect of it is that I was going to say Western culture, but it's not even the West, because I mean South America is still the West. But in let's say modern culture, we don't have the kind of ritual or traditions set up around these things. So it's like you were mentioning Pinchbeck. I know that in his Breaking Open the Head, he was talking about people having to go through these. When you have to look for something that's illegal, that's kind of a rite of passage in the modern world. So we have our own rites of passages, and it's very, it's like a randomized algorithm that's kind of like adopting and co-opting different parts of different traditions in order to create a setting in which to take it, which includes like transformational festivals and that kind of thing. But again, like it's unrooted from tradition and from a longer lineage. And I think that's also where things become shaky in that sense. Because if you look at like ayahuasca, which has its more like traditional ceremonial settings, which I think are very beneficial for that kind of thing. And I think it's also beneficial for other substances. Is really like that setting, that container in which to safely explore these realms, rather than a kind of like, pop some mushies and go to a concert. And who knows what could happen, or which also could have its own merits, but it takes it again, like it's a contextualization. And I think in so many ways, the modern world loses its context. So I feel for me, I have not been so much immersed in the cultures surrounding it so much as creating culture based on the experiences, which also, I think you read the pieces that we mentioned in our correspondence briefly, right? The psychedelic bar mitzvah. Yeah. So it gets into a lot of that kind of that getting back to the origins, to the source, to like finding original thought and seeing how culture goes through these different tiers and levels of kind of like cauterization, where it's kind of like you go to the marketplace and you buy a fruit that's like steps removed from actually like growing the fruit and picking your own fruit. So I'm more like a psychic gardener in that sense, where I'd rather go into the experience and try to, and of course there's going to be outside influences magnetized towards it, because it's inescapable unless you don't speak a language, like then you'd have a completely, if you're illiterate, you're going to have a completely different kind of experience. But for the most part, I try to like also like extract myself from it and exfoliate influences and try to find the outlooks and outputs that uphold their integrity in accordance with my experience, and also to question, like, okay, but where did this notion come from? Like, why do I believe this, or why do I feel this way about it? You know, like, and some of it I can take creative liberties with. Like, if I encounter something in a DMT space and I feel that this is like a stargate within myself, through which I'm able to access a point that can access timelessness, through which, you know, like you can gain larger access to time and space and information. I take it with a grain of salt. It's like, oh, it's a cool sci-fi with a P, like sci-fi concept, you know. It's like psychic fiction, and so I can take the liberties with it without like taking myself too seriously and becoming a raving nut out in the world, talking about these things as like viable possibilities. But I like to entertain the kind of spiritual fiction, because I think that is what spirituality ultimately is. They're various fictions that complement the facts of life. They're like spices and flavors with which we can contextualize and configure our own, maybe morality, but at least how we stand in life, and why we feel the way we feel about things. Like it gives us an unspeakable tuning fork, let's say. It's like, I always consider the psychedelic experience like a tuning fork in the road. It's a fork in the road, but it's a tuning fork. Like, there's choices, but there's also something that we can weigh it against, which is basically just our own intrinsic inner compass, compassionate compass, that becomes exfoliated once we drop the noise of the mind. But then the other thing is that, to bring it back kind of to the control systems and culture, like ayahuasca is considered jungle TV in the Amazon, because it's, you know, because of the visions and things like that. It's kind of like there's an entertainment quality to it. But the thing is, nobody's broadcasting from behind that screen. Like, the only thing that's broadcasting from behind that screen is some kind of Gaian intelligence, or some kind of like naturally occurring transmission, right? It's not, nobody has genetically engineered this plant matter to have like a Coke commercial or a Pepsi commercial in the midst of it. But when you look at the technodelic realm, which is, you know, like the internet and media and all these kinds of things, it's like an emulation of that. Television is the distant vision that you're watching, but there's somebody puppeteering from behind the screen. So that's, I think, the distinction between it. Like, once, what I call vegetal reality, VR, the like kind of like inner interface on the intersection of the spiritual and the virtual, when that becomes an external technological interface, that's when the mind can be moved by external forces. And that's, I think, where the dangers can come in, the hooks and traps.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, that having that grounding and healthy attachment and humor from the narratives that might develop as a result of the psychedelic experience is so essential to maintaining one's own kind of stability in the face of these overwhelming psychic disruptions and destabilizations and things like this. And this is precisely, I think, why is really important to have critical voices like Jason, particularly nuanced ones where, you know, I think, you know, Jan Irvin goes over the edge. What was his name? Dave McGowan, the late Dave McGowan, is less antagonistic, but still, you know, I think the Laurel Canyon stuff, if you've come across that at all, really fascinating. But it's essentially, to sum it up in a nutshell, Dave McGowan wrote a book called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, about the Laurel Canyon kind of psychedelic rock scene and kind of general countercultural scene, and the enormous amount of military intelligence background and connections there with almost everybody who is involved in that scene in a big way.
And is this in the 60s, or this is more recent?
Yeah, so this is like, we're talking...
Well, that explains the military marching band outfits that the Beatles were wearing.
Yeah, good point, actually. Yeah, and you know, as well, and
yeah, that was definitely part of the aesthetic, was a kind of like, which is interesting for a kind of boundary dissolution culture to take on the attire of a rigorously structured military aesthetic. I think it's kind of an interesting little point of focus there.
it is, yeah, and there's, you know, you can look at it in one way as kind of a satirical appropriation of something, or, you know, there's another way of looking at it, is a straight up, just like, this is a kind of actual more of a continuity, and you know, for example, Jimi Hendrix playing Star Spangled Banner, many people took that as being a satirical comment on the Vietnam War, which I'm sure it was to some extent, but he
shreds it. He shreds it. Yeah.
still kind of
It's like tearing the flag, right? Shredding the anthem is like tearing the flag.
but it's also kind of like, yeah, we're American, you know, and the
Right.
pranksters with the American flag. So that there's this undertow of a kind of patriotism that you could read into. So I think.
Well, I think that's something. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think it's something that's always arising when we take an adversarial stance. We empower the thing we're against, right? Like, for instance, if you would completely ignore the kind of like patriotic or like nationalist side of things, then you know that you can basically just like edit that out of your work. But if you take a stance against it, now it's also a part of your work. Like, you're actually attracting the thing that you're repelling just by being its opposite, right?
Yeah, yeah, and energizing it, and yeah, by projecting your enemy archetype on that
Right.
force.
I have a joke, and this is kind of like my way to, because people kind of glorify logic, and I have a saying that is my flogic is lawless, which is the idea that logic itself can be so flawed. Like, okay, so logic is based on this basic kind of like syllogistic anthem, right? Like, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Basic logic. Okay, so war can only exist because of peace, right? They hold space for each other. So that means peace is the root of all war. So we must wage war on peace in order to have a more logic. See, it seems like it makes sense rationally, but actually, as soon as you think a step further, it's like, wait a minute, that actually doesn't really make sense. So that's always what happens with dualistic poles, is they kind of like hold themselves in bounds. They allow each other to exist.
Yeah, and you see this with with oppositional movements and the conspiracy culture and things like this, of the kind of empowering of the David Icke's of the world, and to some extent the Alex Joneses, of imparting this incredible demonic kind of spiritual power to the ruling elite, which, I mean, I'm not even necessarily saying that I'm completely closed off. To some extent, there may be some truth to that, because I mean, I'm fairly sure that there are lots of different groups engaging in strange occult rituals, and many be composed of psychopathic billionaires, most likely, and some of those rituals may even have the desired effects. They certainly seem to be winning the current game of society for now, although how much longer, I don't know. But where was I going with that? Yeah, in terms of the opposition, kind of.
Yeah.
Get this.
Well, yeah, like you're saying, I think those things do have the kernel of truth, but the thing is that somebody like an Alex Jones, of course, is also very much driven by kind of like a media power drive and ratings and money, and it's an entertainment thing. Ultimately, he's performing, and he goes off with it beyond the scope of kind of like the nuance of it, and it becomes more like a cartoony puppet show of performative personality, that it's no longer really about just getting this information out there. It's also about gaining more following and more resources from that, which is why I've never really been drawn to the whole conspiratorial world, and one of the reasons I like Jason's work in that regard, and I feel more leaning towards that, is that it's not so much conspiracy theory as complicity theory. He always finds a way to take a kind of responsibility or like turn it inward and see like where this is something existing within himself, and that's something I find more attractive than the kind of like pointing the fingers or like casting shadows on scapegoats.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so so rare to find anyone really taking these kinds of ideas fairly seriously, but in a genuinely intelligent way. That, you know, there are, you know, there are elite circles of abuse rings and all these kinds of horrendous, nefarious activity that's covered up with the full blessing of the law and the you know, the courts and the churches and these kinds of things. But of course, all of that material is, for the most part, damned data, as Charles Fort would put it. You know, it's like
damned like a beaver dam, or damned like,
well,
damned to hell.
No, but it's also, yeah, it's dammed up in the sense that it's
right.
It's not entering into the mainstream flow of
yeah.
Well, because you know, it's just not. It can't be incorporated for the most part into the narrative except through very tiny controlled forces. Like, okay, we have Einstein stuff. We have a bit of, okay, there we go, Jimmy Savile, but he's dead now, so it doesn't really lead to it.
Well, you can think of like I think it was the Golden Globes or something, where Ricky Gervais kind of like called out, and that you got to see that he called out a bunch of the Hollywood folks in the room. He mentioned Epstein, and he's like, "Oh, come on, I know he's your friend." Like, he was kind of like gesturing the crowd, and everybody was like, "Oh, it's so brave that he's like sticking it to them." But at the same time, I think all that stuff was pre-approved by the networks, and it's just a way of kind of acknowledging the darkness that's there, while at the same time memifying it, so that it's like hiding in plain sight, that kind of thing, you know. It's like it's bringing it out to the front so that we don't have to come after it. It's like we know we're flawed, we know we're fucked up. It's fine. We're acknowledging it here through this figurehead, and then so in a way he also makes himself complicit by showing up, even if it is to call it out.
Yeah,
he's still again incorporating himself into that network. So it's the whole thing. It's kind of trying to find a metaphor for it. I'm just seeing like it's not even an Ouroboros. It's kind of like some like weird tessellation of like bigger fish eating littler fish, and it's like some kind of like Russian dollhouse of complicity and intrigue.
Yeah, I mean, there was that film that came out a few years ago, a year or two ago now. I can't remember. Under a Steel Sky or something like that. I don't know if you came across this one, but Jason reviewed it on Horticulture when it came out, and he described it very much in similar ways to your description.
Under the Silver Lake.
Under the Silver, yeah, something like that. I've not watched it yet, but
that's funny because actually, right as I was delving into Jason's work, a friend of mine, because I live in Los Angeles, and actually we went for a walk around the Silver Lake yesterday. Thought about the film, but a friend of mine had said, he's like, "Oh, you should check this out." He's like, "It's not a very good film, but I think you'd appreciate it because you're in LA, and it's kind of like a lot of the stuff that you're thinking about right now. You should check it out." And I watched it, and I was like, "I bet Jason has watched this," you know. And I looked it up, and I saw that he had the video of him kind of doing I think it was like a liminalist audience participation chat right around
and it basically, you know, the interpretation that Jason gave was that this is a controlled release of this, a kind of preemptive admission, kind of hiding in sight, as you're saying with the Golden Globes.
Right. And you were mentioning with the pinchbeck Me Tooing himself kind of thing. It's like jumping the gun and shooting yourself in the foot with it. Yeah.
Me Tooing yourself, but in a controlled way, is actually still manages to hide probably a lot from so that the confession is partial and contains its own kind of you know, the revelation of apparent trauma on the part of his mother and aunt or whatever it was.
Right. Well, I feel I feel a few things about that particular instance, like listening to you guys talking about it. Is one is that if somebody makes an apology and it's a thoughtful apology, it's still never enough. Right? There is no real, nothing's ever good enough. Like even though, because I remember reading his account, and yes, there was some of it that was like making it about him, and there was some of it was thoughtful, kind of like, you know, I've become aware of my faults and I'm working on this. And then there is also the element where it's like a strategic move in order to kind of receive pats on the back, or still be like, still receive work or still sell books through it. You know, where it's like, by the way, I'm doing the work, I'm working on this, like, don't shut me out. Like it's, there is like a strategic maneuvering working into it, but some of it is also a kind of like apology and admission, which I think there is a noble side to it as well. But again, it's like we're all such mixed bags, you know. We're like swirlies of light and dark. So it's babies in bathwater, you know. Some of them drowning, some of the water's poisoned.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, the thing I think it came up in the discussion about Pinchbeck and this kind of thing is it's odd, because then I find myself in having my reservations about, you know, for example, inviting Daniel Pinchbeck to speak at, say, Breaking Convention or whatever. I'm sort of supporting a kind of cancel culture, which is something that in general I have no time for at all. I think is really stupid and infantile and immature. And also I mean, thinking about it, the idea that someone honestly owning up to their misdeeds and saying, I feel bad about this, I want to apologize for anything I've done, and I want to do work to, you know, not make these kind of mistakes again. That obviously, as an honest move, is, it's like, okay, well, why should anyone be? Is that, you know, you get into these, in the identity politics world, it's just unbelievable the amount to which people will kind of grovel and debase themselves in an attempt to placate the kind of bloodthirsty hordes of keyboard warriors that are going to come after them for saying the slightest sort of whatever it is, comment that could be interpreted as this or that.
Well, it's also, again, it's like it's a dam, right? That stops the flow of conversation. There's so many key words that can be tossed into the conversation, or tossed like shade onto another person in order to stop the conversation. It's almost like that. I think it's a Matrix thing, right? Where they throw the thing, like the mouth disappears. It's like, it's that kind of feel where it's like you're no longer allowed to speak because you are now this or this or this, and it's like it stops it dams the nuance.
Yeah, exactly. But then you get, in the context of Pinchbeck, for example, and, you know, as you say, everyone's a mixed bag, and I can't pretend to kind of really know what was going on with Pinchbeck when he did that, but it did. When I read it, it felt more insincere and kind of self-martyring than it did sort of humble and honest. And that's partly due to my own kind of, I guess, anti-Pinchbeck bias. You know, I mean, I have met him, and the brief moment that I met him, I found him very charming. I
find it so interesting. You said charming, and Jason said charismatic even, and I've always, those are not two words that I would add. Have you met? I've met him on a few occasions. They've always been kind of like odd interaction. It's funny too, because I've met him on a number of occasions, but I don't know if he would know who I am. He probably maybe through like internet interactions, and I'm also friends with lots of friends of his, but it's always been like, I remember I had read Breaking Open the Head, which I think is a great book. And then the first time I met him was right around 2012. It come out, and he was doing a lot of speaking at festivals. So I remember going up to him afterwards, and I wanted to show him some artwork, just kind of like that's an easy way to connect without having to waste too many words, just to kind of like give a window into, you know, my experiences. And I remember he looked at it and he was like, "Oh, that's cool. Well, maybe you can send it to me or something like that to like look at it." But it was so weird because I'm like right there in the moment. So it was like a let's save now for later kind of thing. That was the first interaction, which was kind of like, well, that's all right. You know, that's kind of like a missed opportunity or whatever. And then I had a conversation when I lived in this artist collective in San Francisco, and he was there, and we had tea, and he was sitting there, and we talked a little bit about Jodorowsky, because he had just done like I'd watched that thing where Jodorowsky is leading him through Paris, which I thought was, I really liked it. It's like, I felt it was one of the most honest portrayals of Pinchbeck, because it was very humble, and it was very like vulnerable. And so I really enjoyed that thing. So we talked a little bit about that. And then there were a few instances at like festivals where he would, festivals and after parties and things where he was kind of, it felt like an interloper that would like click his Lego cube into whatever group I was walking with, where all of a sudden it's like, oh, where shall we go to this party in this hotel room? It's like, who is this? Oh, it's, and then it kind of like clicked in. It's like, oh, it's Pinchbeck. It's kind of like Daniel was saying, oh, it's a minor celebrity who's all right, cool, yeah, let's do this thing. But it's never been like a very meaningful interaction. It's always been kind of like, it's never been a, hey, Michelangelo, how are you, or something like that. It's always kind of like moving towards figures or like towards a kind of vibe in order to get to something or towards somewhere, kind of thing, which I'm very sensitive to, that kind of energy, I feel.
Yeah.
To like seeing like, okay, well, what's going on here? Like, what is this interaction? Okay, so this person is trying to get to that event there, but wants to go with like some people, and like we have kind of a vibe going on here. So wants to go along. That's going okay. Yeah. More like that kind of thing. So I don't want to make any kind of, I can't make any kind of judgment on his character as a person based on those interactions. It's just been like strange, somewhat impersonal, personal encounters. Yeah. But more so, it's like from getting to know him through his own writings, which I find very interesting in the sense that they're not what they think they are. Like, I think I put that in a tweet regarding 2012, and I jokingly refer to him as Quetzalcoatlbeck because his allusions to being the incarnation of Quetzalcoatl. But I feel like that book, 2000, like Breaking Open the Head, I think is a really good account of kind of like a historical summary of psychedelia. It brings in some interesting thoughts. I thought it was a really interesting like kind of like excavation of himself and like reclaiming of who he is ancestrally. It really felt like near the end of the book, like the scene where he's like in the crowd and the camera pans back and he's like, now he's Batman or something, like he found his like ancestral superpower of knowing who he is, and it zooms back and you hear like the voiceover of like, now that I know about the cabals in the world and how these geometries play into the design of this world and co-opted by corporations, I must take my stance. And like it felt like that kind of just like somebody who claims the superpower of having found themselves or knowing themselves. And I really enjoyed that as a conclusion and as just kind of like a whole. And then 2012, Return of Quetzalcoatl came out, and I was excited to check that out. And at first, it's a careful examination of this random thing and that random thing, and how this crop circles play in, and oh, I had this feeling around that, da, da, da. And then it goes into all like the Mayan lore, and then the twist happens, and it seems to me like this is where the meat of the thing happens, where he feels like he's like basically summarizes everything he has just researched and paints it off like it was now channeled, and it means that he is the return of Quetzalcoatl, while everything that he just channeled is really the assimilation of everything he has just researched, releasing itself in one fell swoop, making it seem like it's coming from somewhere else, right? But it's actually just literally the information he has just been showing us he's been researching, that now he has this like messianic delusion, and then the next thing is like this Burning Man kind of like burnout scene that's going on. And I felt like that's the story that book tells. It's not a story of a prophecy of like a shift that's happening. it's actually on a much more personal level. It's the story of a burnout and the way the snake can swallow its own tail, T-A-L-E, like the way the snake swallows its own bullshit. There's a term called shut-eye, which is like a psychic who is a charlatan, but who begins to believe his own bullshit and actually believes that he is actually psychic, you know? And I feel like that's the tale that's being told there. And it is kind of like a caveat, even though it's like the opposite of a Trojan horse, where the Trojan horse is trying to steer some secret agenda in through a hidden front. I feel like in this case, he's pushing an agenda, but the truth is smuggled in through that. And that's what I found interesting about that book and what makes it a success. So it's not like people are like, oh, you put an expiration date on this book, see, the prophecy never happened. It's like, it's not about that. It's actually a personal case study of kind of like the perils and the caveats of, similar to Jason's Icarus story of like, because we had a similar situation, right, where he believed he was Lucifer. Right? This kind of idea of like this archetypal charisma that's possessed a person can be very alluring, and it is a part of the kind of the traps of transcendence. So in that sense, I find Pinchbeck interesting as a case study in that sense, not so much as a charismatic figure, because I'm like comparing it to like a Terence McKenna, because I remember when I first saw him speak, I was looking for like, so what's out there now? Like Terence is gone, like who is out there now that can kind of like spellbindingly orate and bind the audience to their voice and hold their attention in such a way that you want to hear what's going to come out next. But instead, here's this like kind of like nebbish dude who starts every talk with the same introduction rather than letting people just see him and make their own decisions. It starts with the narration of like, I came from kind of a rationalist, existentialist background in New York. My mother had slept with Jack Kerouac, and I came to kind of an existential crisis and realized that I look back to college days when I did some psychedelic. Like the whole thing just didn't feel like it was like an engaging, spellbind. Like, I didn't sense the charisma. I sensed like a very troubled, broken person who was a really good writer, like was able to articulate themselves really concisely through writing, but felt very pained to listen to as a speaker. So I didn't sense the kind of like what I call charm or charisma, in that sense that it would like weave a spell or weave a kind of intrigue that drew me in.
I came up with a phrase specifically relevant to Daniel Pinchbeck, which is anti-charisma. I mean, you know, I when I met him personally, then I could see a kind of warmth there very briefly. I've never seen it before since. There was a smile and a kind of flash of human warmth. I was like, okay, this guy has a ability to appear seemingly connect with other people in a way. But I have to say, all the times I've seen him speak, I've actually not been able to listen. By the way, your McKenna impression is frighteningly accurate.
Thanks. Yeah, I've definitely absorbed a great deal of that old bard. Well, there's also, I mean, take into account that the world has an oracular quality to it, that all is symbolically encoded, and the name Pinchbeck means fool's gold. And he himself brought this out in his writings. He revealed this, but I find it a very interesting little tidbit. It's like when you'd find gold and it wasn't the real thing, that's called Pinchbeck. So again, I feel like it's the case study is there not in what it is professing. You have to look beyond the message at the medium.
Yeah, it seems to me a interestingly similar way that Jason actually looks at Castaneda.
No, exactly. I feel like it's a similar thing. It's breaking down the transcendental allure, and same thing with Strieber. The way he was looking at Strieber, it's bringing it back down to the human level, to the broken level, in order to extract its influence from you, and to see it as equal and as equally as broken as the rest of us, as fragile as the rest of us.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what is unfortunately missing with a lot of vocal speakers in the psychedelic world, is that ability to reflect adequately on one's own experience and one's own work. Is what I like about reading your writing, is that you're an intensely psychedelic artist and writer, but you're always kind of folding back in on it and going, okay, well, it's just all right. This is bedazzling, but maybe there's something behind the bedazzlement that's more more is more real, perhaps. That
Mm-hmm.
there's something interesting in the bedazzlement itself. There's something here that we can play this with language, and we can play with these structures and these images and archetypes, and it's fun and it's cool. But let's keep our kind of groundedness. As I say, the humor is a really important something. I was speaking about with my friend Ollie Genbash today, actually. His interest is in humor and psychedelics, and both of us have come through the breaking convention world. He was one of the founder members of the original psychedelic society here in Kent University, which led to the creation of breaking convention. But we've both kind of gone through our phase of intense engagement with this world, and now we're both sort of a little bit wary, becoming more and more wary of the whole thing.
Yeah. But if it takes itself too seriously, there's a saying that says, what is the saying? It's like just everything that is too serious has something very humorous about it, and everything that is very humorous has something very serious about it. It's again the poles and the extremes, right?
Yeah, I like that.
But I find that, like what you were saying about what you see in my writings, it's exactly that. Let's look at the fabric of consciousness. Like, what is it that we're using to grasp our perceptions or to pattern the sensory data that's coming in? And it's language, whether that's spoken or written words, or like a phonetic alphabet, or whether that's imagery, or whether that's a musical language, or whatever it may be. Like, when you start looking at those patternings, then you break down the enchantment. And this comes down to the Eric Davis's outlooks, which is very much like there's as much enchantment, as much magic in the enchantment as there is in the disenchantment. Because it's when you're in that place beyond belief, or that liminal like suspension of belief, possibility blooms. But when you break it down and see like how the illusion is technically constructed, that doesn't necessarily bring you out of that state, but it just gives you a deeper understanding of how it's put together. It's the same. I actually went to the Magic Castle here in Los Angeles with Eric and our magician friend Ferdinando Buscema, an Italian magician who's a great human being. And we had a lot of great conversations also about this, and how stage magic is very much like stand-up comedy, in the sense that it's almost like a telekinesis. I was going to say like a telepathy, but a telekinesis in how it moves the objects in the room towards laughter from a distance, right? By various cues that are constructed in a very systematic and strategic way to have a certain kind of effect that elicits laughter or awe. So when the magician is up there and he does his trick, ultimately the goal is to elicit a sense of wonder and a sense of awe, and for a moment to still the answers and to live with the question. And the same thing when a comedian is up on stage, he'll say a number of different things, and ultimately it's like a bell rings and laughter. It's like Pavlovian almost, laughter ensues, unless you're somebody that's sitting there and you're watching the magician and you're constantly looking at like, how is he doing this? And then you're like, oh, I think he did it like da 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 da. What you're doing now is you're basically shooting yourself in the foot, because you're now bereaving yourself of the sense of wonder and awe. Just like if you're looking at like, oh, why is that funny though? oh, it's because you said it like this. Like you start breaking down a joke. It's like, yeah, great. Now you figured out why it's funny, but you missed out on the actual healing merits of the thing. But if you yourself are a magician or comedian, that deconstruction actually can lead towards you making more powerful or humorous illusions. So it's the ebb and flow of enchantment, disenchantment, of void and imagination, of form and formlessness, and learning how but I call it abyss malleability. It's like how malleable the abyss is, and then it gives you the fluidity of thought, so as not to concretize into this is the way things are, and we got to fit in a certain kind of, because we're like mimes in a way, like we create these boxes around ourselves, and then we ourselves become trapped in it and forget that we're constructing it like that. So if you like become aware of like that, it's actually like a self-constructed limitation. There's more room to breathe in that, which is also why I feel like it's important, and I do this, and Jason does this, is that to write yourself into the narrative and to make it grounded again in this experiential side, which I love Eric's writings, but he's very much like on the more the exploration of ideas and the more like academic side of things, even though he has an enchantment in his use of language, and I really enjoy his writings. His journey is not so much figured into his writings, and even to a more extreme, so with Anthony Peake, who also, I by the way, I don't know Peake, I've never met him, but he reached out to me in like 2006 when he was first working on, when the book was still called Cheating the Ferryman. And he had, I think, found me on MySpace because of the Julian James connection, and he had like kind of plugged his thing he was working on, which was very resonant with what I was thinking of and working on at the time. So we had a little correspondence then, and then I think like a few years ago, probably like 10 years after that, 2016 or something, he like popped into my head again. I was like, whatever happened to that Anthony Peake guy? And then I ended up finding him just like on the modern platforms, and read a couple of his books. But I feel like he's also somebody who takes himself very seriously and suffers a lot from looking for validation, but not getting his self-importance reflected back at him, which is a constant and very transparent struggle that he exhibits on his social persona.
Well, Anthony or Tony is one of the most interesting guys currently on the kind of psychedelic scene for me, because in his like day-to-day, everyday persona, he is one of the most grounded, approachable, down-to-earth and funny guys that you're likely to meet, who's like a published, he's a name, like people know him, and he's had books published, and he's got good connections, and he's been interviewed by Daniel Pinchbeck and all this kind of stuff. So he's on the scene, and someone else of his level could very easily develop a kind of standoffishness, which he really doesn't have, which I really like and appreciate about him, is that he's super, super friendly, super welcoming to anyone who is interested or interesting, and is really has his feet on the ground in that sense. And the kind of the some of the stuff he puts on social media is very much, it doesn't reflect that part of him so much.
It seems like it's more like an exposition of his inner struggle than the things you just mentioned. And also from having interacted with him through social media, it's interesting because I don't as much get, and we're kind of like, we're delving now, I mean, I'll still like look at it as case studies, but we're delving more into like the gossip areas right now. But I don't get as much the warm welcoming unless it serves his own, it's like folds back in on himself or serving his own interests. And the example from that is like, I had reached out, and the first thing when I sent him my website, the first thing he said is, oh, you would like my book, the Doors of Perception one, breaking open the doors of perception or whatever it was. So it was an instantly like folding in, not a like reflection on what he had seen, but a like pushing his own thing forth. And then I know that he was really into the OA, the Netflix show, which is all about like near-death experiences. And I ended up working on that show in a small capacity. And then unrelated to that, like I'd written to him because I was reading the Daemon while I was on set of the show, and I thought he might find that intriguing. And then I ended up meeting the creator and star of the show, Britt Marling, on a separate occasion, and just like chatted with her, and we had a nice connection. And I mentioned his book, and I sent him word of that, which really elated him. He was very excited about that prospect that his work had reached them. But then I noticed later on he had commented on one of her threads recently, and he had framed it in a way that, again, like shot himself in the foot, because he hadn't looked at who was the person bringing him these messages. What he wrote basically was, I heard that my work had been brought to your attention by an extra on the set of the OA, but it's like, okay, that's, if you knew who this person was, if you had said like the Ungoogleable Michaelangelo or an artist person, because that's how she got to know me. It's not as like a nobody in a sea of heads. It was more like as equals, as like an artist, multimedia artist that had come up to her and had like a connection with it. So it was like he had taken the information that had aggrandized his vision, but he hadn't looked at the person bringing it to him as though I were but some messenger, but actually I have a whole world as well that might be of intrigue to him, and had actually sent him the first episode of my podcast, which has materials in it that I think would be very intriguing to him, which was, I don't know if you listened to it, but my first guest is an amazingly talented artist named Loga, who has chronicled her dreams for like the past over 3 decades, and found all these continuities throughout it of these characters in her dreams that she then learned correspond to different parts of her autonomic nervous system, including a kind of trickster god who it turns out corresponds to a recently discovered pineal tumor. And so we examined this whole thing as like, is it a tumor or a spiritual growth? And is this tumor the thing that has radiated these experiences, these psychic experiences, or have the psychic experiences coalesced into this tumor? And like all the different elements. I even mentioned his work, like the Cheating the Ferryman theory and the Damon Edelon dichotomy on this program, and I'd sent it to him because I thought this would be something that he would kind of jump on, because it's very experiential and akin to like the kind of areas of his examination. But again, it wasn't, I never received word back from that. So it feels like I guess again, it's the duality between kind of our social personas and our in-person personas.
Yeah, and social media distorts our interactions in all kinds of strange ways as well, you know.
Right.
I mean,
I always try to look at who's, if I get a message or somebody follows or whatever it is, I always try to look at like, who is the person that's showing interest? Because similarly, as like if somebody would give me a compliment, that compliment is only going to be worth as much as the person giving it to me, you know what I mean? So it's like, oh, this person is interested. Is this person interesting? You know, I always want to like see like where it's coming from and what, because it's funny too when you think of it. And I know I cut you off. I'm sorry, we'll cycle back around, but I know he's been doing a lot of work about kind of the autonomy of entities in the psychedelic sphere, right? The idea like, are they autonomous entities or are they splinters of a fragment itself that come back around to communicate through us symbolically, through us to us? And similarly, the technodelic sphere or the social media sphere does a similar thing. Like I am kind of like a disembodied entity from where he's standing, who's coming and who's sending transmissions. And it's like, am I an aspect of you that's sending materials out, or is this an autonomous entity behind the screen sending configurations of text, you know? So it's kind of an interesting analog. I just made that connection, and that social media is its own kind of psychedelic interface.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, the direct line of influence from LSD through Silicon Valley into
true, that too.
The growth of the internet.
Silicon itself being a crystal matrix.
Yeah, oh, there you go. You know,
the liquid crystal.
Liquid crystal. But yeah, I mean, with Anthony, I just my feeling is just I wish I wish I could get him to embrace his outsider status more fully and just lean into it, like rather than rather than be too concerned about who's reading the books, who isn't, who's reviewing.
Right.
What
Well, he's trying to appeal to the academic crowd. I think that's kind of interesting. It's funny that the conversation is surrounding this particular person who you know and who I don't actually know, but there again, it's like it's a case study. It's not even about them so much as about the phenomenon of what their circumstances are. But I see the limitations that he bumps into and the struggle that he puts out through his social media output, which is very much the wanting to appeal to a particular academic kind of crowd and gain the validation from them, and then seeing other people making similar connections as he has years after he has made it, and kind of like a sense of resentment or disdain, even though it's playfully put out there, there's still like a very tangible nugget of truth to it. But it feels maybe, yeah, like you're saying, like to lean into, maybe you're trying to appeal to the wrong crowd, like the Björk song, All Is Full of Love, it's not coming to you from the sources that you want. Like you're looking towards this thing, but there's actually maybe more embrace coming from these more, what would you call it? They're like the outsider, kind of the outskirts of the scene. To maybe more lean in towards that. But I think what you're also saying when you're saying leaning into that is to just take the sacrament.
Well, perhaps, yeah. I mean, that would be another way of actually experiencing something that one is writing about. But I mean, certainly, I think what I felt when I read his last book, The Hidden Universe, and I touched on this in an email to him a little while before our last conversation, which was a podcast that I did with him, and I said one of the things I wasn't really sold on was at the end he brings in Nick Bostrom's simulated universe theory, and it's like, okay, right, so I've got this model, it's the cheating the ferryman kind of Damon Idol, and lots of parallel universes. It's quite a complex model, and a lot of things are going into it, and it's very subtle. It took me like reading quite a few of his books, in some cases more than once, to start to get a grasp of actually what the full kind of ramifications of it. And it is quite nuanced kind of take on things. I can't speak for it as a verifiably true model, but it seems like it has some intuitive kind of juice to it.
There were some traces of it in my Burning Man piece too. I don't know if you picked up on that, but the kind of like the time travel element of it, kind of like the premonitions casting back to then fulfill that moment.
The retro causality sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I call the ferryman theory. I've summed it up as a Groundhog's Daisy chain of retrocausal reimagination.
I like that. Have you sent that to Tony?
I don't. I think I might have sent the quote, because I mentioned I coined that on another podcast where I mentioned it. And I think whenever I've mentioned him or his theory on some show, I've usually sent the link or like tagged him in the link, but I don't think he's actually come around to any of that. Yeah. But yeah, I've definitely memeified some of the and like condensed some of the basic theory to make it easily ingestible for others.
That's kind of something that I'd quite like to do more of as well, as kind of turn something me and Ollie were talking about, is turning some of his ideas into memes and things like that.
Well, I think it's similar to what I did with self-portraits as other people for all the episodes, but for Jason's episodes, is to kind of like create an introduction to the person, because especially since he has such a large mind field, that it becomes hard for people to kind of get a sense of, like a condensed sense of who this person is and what ideas they lord over to kind of try and create a more condensed introduction for people so that they don't just fall into the conversation and have to figure out the landscape, to kind of prefabricate a lens through which to be able to contextualize the landscape of the conversation.
Yeah, that's a piece of feedback I've got on my podcast so far, is that they just drop into a conversation, and that there needs to be more work done to actually introduce the person in question. So yeah, that's something I'll...
Jason is also very lax about it.
Yeah.
Today we've got the Liminalist, the podcast between. Today we've got Luke Dodson. And then we just go right into it.
Yeah, I like that. It's a sort of Joe Rogan has a similar way of just running, just drop into a conversation.
Google it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But
Ungoogleable.
The Ungoogleable, yeah. But yeah, with the last book that Anthony did, The Hidden Universe, it kind of fell down for me, because at the end he brings in a kind of trendy current sort of idea and philosophy of the old sort of simulation hypothesis reheated by Nick Bostrom a few years ago with some sort of fancy maths and things like that. It's like, okay, cool, that's its own little interesting thought experiment for those who are kind of drawn to that kind of that literally the universe is a computer simulation. It's like, okay, that stands on its own as a thing.
Yeah.
For me, it's like all that into his model is like, well, it's like you should have more grounding in your own thing. This is your own thing. You should finish on your idea, not on Nick Bostrom, not on anyone else.
Well, that's also the dichotomy that I feel from the online persona is constantly very nostalgic for times in the 70s, or like when he had long hair, and when the people he knew, and like kind of like a sadness as he's getting older, and this kind of thing. But it seems very separated from any of the Damon Edelon stuff. It's like, okay, well, if that's the story, then where is this the mournful old man in your younger experiences? Like, where are the shades of that cast back? Like, I want to feel the story of Cheating the Ferryman in your own narrative. Like, how does it tether into that? Or what is the takeaway that an audience can bring away? Like, if it ends, like, I'm just speculating right here based just off what you're saying, right? I haven't read that book. But if it ends on this kind of like other like theoretical field, basically, rather than something you can take away from having read it and apply to your life, such as what I get from Cheating the Ferryman, is very much the solace that will always have Paris. You know, like the old Casablanca line, will always have Paris. The idea that all moments are perfectly preserved along the space-time coordinates of their actuation. That in William Blake's words, nothing lasts, but nothing is lost, because we'll catch it again the next time around. We'll always, just like this conversation, even though it is literally being recorded, it's also being inscribed into kind of like the Akashic record, or however you want to look at it. It's embedded within the unfolding narrative of space and time, or I guess time being space's digestive system. It's forever embedded along these coordinates. So as the zoetrope spins along these images again, they are set in motion once again. So the people we have lost, the connections we have lost, the moments of joy and sorrow, they are forever preserved along these moments, along these coordinates. And that's what I get from it, why it's appealing to me, because every other model of an afterlife seems to point towards something outside of here and now. Right? Reincarnation is still the sense that some other time, some other place, some other person, but the idea of a reincantation, the idea of life being a musical, the soul being a musical unfolding, and that each loop of it is a kind of cover song that gets to play a slight variation on the theme, I find very appealing, and it gives value to the present. And it imbues things with the kind of urgency and stakes that do open our hearts and tether us in the moment to really be present, because we'll always be present in these moments. So we might as well imbue them with as much goodness and meritorious increase as we can.
Mm. Well, I think that's a nice note to wrap up the conversation. Look forward to many cycles back around to this conversation on our
Yeah,
eternal return. It's been really great
yeah,
to connect with you.
yeah. It's really pleasant.
Yeah, maybe we could do a follow up, maybe a podcast swap. I could go on yours, or if you're up for that, we can negotiate something. Good to talk to you again in the future about things.
Yeah, we'll figure out a way to reconvene one way or another.
Yeah, great. So
Great, man.
even though you're ungoogleable, could anyone watching this get a link to your platform?
Yeah, I mean it's paradoxical because Michelangelo is ungoogleable, so I had to make myself the Ungoogleable Michaelangelo in order to make myself Googleable. But yeah, you can go to my website, which actually I just recently adjusted it to make it very easy, theungoogleable.com.
Right.
And through that you can find the Instagrams and YouTubes and all the other stuff. There's plenty there to unearth.
All right, wicked. Well, thanks for talking to me.
Yeah, man. Likewise. Well, we'll keep in touch. We'll keep an eye on each other.